Everybody's been saying that all the damage over time team needs is that one dedicated support 5-star to bring them back to being a premier composition. So if that's the case, why haven't we gotten them yet? Does HoYo just hate us? Well, maybe. But seeing as how with summoner characters incoming, we're probably looking at a whole year without a DoT buff, perhaps DoT has more underlying problems than we think. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that I think the reason we aren't getting any new DoT supports is because with the massive amounts of design creep on top of the HP inflation problem, one new character won't actually be enough to bring DoT in line with the game's current frontrunners. Even though the team feels like it's been fleshed out enough to have its own identity, there are definitely some not so obvious flaws that make saving this team not as cut and dry as it may seem. To get the full context of the situation, we have to start with the character that made DoT a real team to begin with, Kafka. I'd say she was really the first character to have a kit which works to avoid a particular design problem, in this case being that DoT on its own feels really bad. Fundamentally, it is a very unique alternative to standard damage, with it being completely backloaded on enemy turns. However, they figured out pretty fast that this way of playing was not fun at all. On top of being forced to wait for half of your damage to come in, refreshing a DoT doesn't do anything except reset its cooldown, meaning that in situations where most characters would be making full use of another action, a DoT character would only get the partial damage of their upfront attack. To fix this problem, dedicated DoT characters were given attacks that could make enemies immediately take a portion of the applied DoT's damage without removing it. Sampo had it locked behind his 4th Eidolon, so that was pretty much impossible to get until his first featured run, but Luca and Gwynaifen had it built into their base kits when they released. In 1.2, Kafka really united the team by being able to detonate the entire team's set of DoTs with both her skill and ultimate. The team was strong and had an even more promising future, given that any later character with a strong DoT would immediately increase Kafka's damage output. And this is exactly what happened when Black Swan was released. Her unique Arcana DoT can stack its damage up to 50 times to deal massive DPS, especially with this synergy. The stacking mechanic also dealt with the same repeated action problem that Kafka fixed, but in a different way without DoT detonation. Combined with a defense shredding skill and bonus synergy with other DoTs to help generate more stacks, and it still feels like these two are bound to forever be the definitive DoT combo. So looking at their kits, the initial impression is that we just need more DoT characters. Kafka gets more damage to proc, and Black Swan can further accelerate her stacks. But there's a big issue when it comes to trying to buff these two characters that I haven't seen anyone else talk about. There are other dedicated DoT users in the game, but they're usually not included in the conversation to begin with because, well, they're old 4-stars. Of course they're terrible. But that's not a completely accurate generalization, because characters like Pela and Tingyun are still very useful despite how far supports have come since their release thanks to their solid utility. This contrast makes it very apparent that these older DoT characters sacrifice way too much utility in favor of their own personal DoT damage, which by now has been far outpaced by the damage amplification capabilities of the best supports. So would it have been better if these characters had instead leaned all into being supports? Well, not exactly. Going back to Kafka's abilities, she produces damage based on the original strength of the DoT, meaning she doesn't just want a character that has a DoT effect, she needs characters that have exceptionally strong ones. This is one of the reasons why Zhao Cho, despite being able to hit a 4500 attack stat with the right build, doesn't feel like he contributes that much to the DoT team. When his DoT doesn't do that much, and he lacks utility beyond his damage amp, the top Harmony characters are just better options while also being more usable on other team comps. For Black Swan as well, having another DoT does help her stack, but not as much as you'd think. Her ultimate's Epiphany debuff is really interesting because it makes Arcana count as every type of DoT. This is cool because it means any character that can only detonate their own kind of DoT can now also activate Arcana. But this also synergizes with Black Swan's own basic attack and skill, which give her a chance to apply an additional stack for each kind of DoT on an enemy. This is great because it means she can get full value on her stacking all on her own, but it also means that an additional DoT user will only be contributing to her stacks in this way during her ult's downtime. Her 4th Ascension passive is a similar case, as it further builds more stacks when allies detonate DoTs, but only up to 3 times. Kafka can already max this out with Shock, Arcana, and a weakness break DoT, so unless they are activating DoTs at the same frequency as Kafka, a new support wouldn't be contributing many stacks from that part of Black Swan's kit either. The presence of a DoT alone doesn't actually contribute that much to either Kafka or Black Swan, which is why even though Guinaifen provides all the core things you would think a dedicated DoT support needs to contribute, it's just not enough. It's actually kind of tragic that DoT pretty much lost its identity, that every unit providing a DoT would strengthen the whole team together. If anything, this idea has been completely taken over by follow-up, where their characters all greatly benefit from follow-ups being launched, independent of how strong that follow-up actually is. Fei Xiao gets more ults, Robin gets more energy and ultimate damage procs, and Aventurine gets more stacks on his follow-up and shield. So now when we think about the buff DoT needs, there's 3 avenues. The first one that seems obvious, giving them a support with a strong DoT and DoT damage amp, in which it might be a problem that a support is able to put out that much damage on their own with no setup. The second method is replacing Black Swan or Kafka with a stronger DoT DPS, which could work but definitely doesn't feel warranted at this point even with the power creep of damage units. And the last option that makes the most sense but is also the most difficult, introducing a support with a wildly creative mechanic that can buff DoT in a new and unique way without buffing other teams. Break is about to get Exo Toughness with Fugue, which was teased back in 2.5's Memory of Chaos, but if we look at the endgame modifiers for DoT, they all kind of stink. The one that makes the most sense is action advancing the enemy so they take the full DoT sooner, but then you also have to action advance the enemy. It's the same thing for simulated universe blessings that are all about stats. I don't think they translate well because they ultimately rely on DoT procs, which are still mostly dictated by enemy actions. A support that can enable characters to detonate DoTs is certainly an option, but then does that diminish the usefulness of Kafka's design? It's a tough situation. Furthermore, when we look at the current DoT core and what they need, it feels clear that we want a dedicated DoT sustain and a dedicated DoT damage amplifier. But I feel like not enough people are talking about how even though the supports the team currently uses aren't designed specifically for use in DoT teams, they synergize really well together. HoYo is a no-brainer pick for a healer. Kafka and Black Swan have no defensive utility whatsoever, so the consistent heal and cleanse from HoYo is great, but of course the big thing is the ultimate providing an incredible attack and energy buff. Because DoTs don't have access to the crit modifier, their attack scaling is intentionally much higher, so the 40% increase from the healer slot is really desirable. The energy is also greatly appreciated, as Kafka gets her AoE shock and 100% DoT activation, and Black Swan can have her Arcana not reset for a turn, while also providing access to the aforementioned stacking mechanics. When it comes to the damage supports, I mean, we all know how disgustingly strong Robin and Ranmei are with their overloaded designs, but they also both have excellent synergy with DoT. Even with Robin's crit buffs being irrelevant to this team, the damage buff, attack buff, and action advance provide all the stats that Kafka and Black Swan want. On the other hand, Ranmei provides all the utility that the duo wants, with weakness break efficiency and faster DoT procs with extended weakness breaks, and that's on top of her permanent speed and damage buffs and a little bit of break effect to marginally increase the damage from weakness break DoTs. So a proper buff that will actually help DoT would not only need to give characters that provide utility and damage equivalent or close to these existing units, but more on top of that, whether it be a powerful DoT or some kind of new mechanic. I mean, they certainly could just make a new support with a 200% DoT damage increase and nothing else, but that really goes against Star Rail's design philosophy of having each new 5-star be unique and interesting. A new support is also an opportunity to fix some of the design problems the team faces, and for DoT, there's quite a few that have become apparent with the high power of newer archetypes. Primarily, the lack of toughness damage from DoTs themselves is starting to feel like a big problem. I mean, when the whole team is centralized around Kafka and Black Swan, it really sucks when enemies aren't weak to both lightning and wind. It's not even just because of the recent rise of break, it has always been ideal to have enemies be weakness broken as much as possible. It not only removes the 10% damage penalty, but gives you a long break from any of the annoying things that enemies can do during their actions. You have to worry significantly less about getting hit by crowd control, which is great, but unfortunately the 25% action delay also means your DoT damage is kicking in even later. Then there's other annoying things like debuffs not carrying over between boss phases. Suddenly my Arcana stacks are gone and my Kafka will do no damage with her skill. Bosses that spawn more enemies are annoying too because they won't have any DoT stacked on them and then are harder to do damage to. I've always liked playing DoT, but I have to admit that it just feels like as a mechanic, it introduces a lot more problems than it does interesting or diverse gameplay, and it feels like that's going to be the case until we get something revolutionary like what Super Break did for the Break archetype. But again, undertaking this is going to be a much bigger design challenge and further spreads thin potential new characters with all the different things they need to accomplish. Now I have no doubts that strong enough buffs would restore the team to its former glory. I mean, we've seen what Sunday has done for Genuine, but accomplishing that for DoT won't be a simple task. There is so much the core needs from its other members, yet replacing Kafka or Black Swan also feels like the wrong move. But at the same time, giving a proper buff would require some significantly overloaded design to have utility on par with the current best supports in the game while also contributing meaningful DoT damage. The worst possible explanation is that HoYo is just giving up on DoT because they don't feel like it has a future, but I'm leaning more towards the idea that DoT will need a big overhaul, whether it be multiple new characters or the strongest support we've ever seen, and that will need some time to cook. I admit, this could be the strongest cope of all time, but I want to believe that it's not just a coincidence we've been waiting this long for one of the oldest teams in the game to get something meaningful. The longer we wait, the greater the buff will be. But like, unironically. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what version 3 brings us. Subscribe for more Honkai Star Rail discussion videos, and as always, thanks for watching.